with Dr. Lindenmeyer. If you can introduce yourself, I'm going to give you 2 minutes. And like I told you earlier, I'll be the clock warden. I'll cut you off at those 2 minutes. I have no shame there. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And my name is Cynthia Lindenmeyer, and I am just really passionate about sacred activism. And that's the marriage of the the inner work and the outer work. And oftentimes, from a spiritual perspective, you may be so focused on meditation and your quiet and your self evolution, yet it's really got to be married with what's going on in the world outside. And then on the other hand, though, there's so many activists in the world who are just maybe engaged in food banks and helping, doing all these missions. And yet if they're not doing the inner work, then they can get burned out easily. So as sacred activists, it's really balancing and achieving that Zen state. And one way I liken it is to our breath work. If you inhale and exhale, you want to reach a state where you're equalizing both the inhale and the exhale. So it's reaching a state of equanimity. So I've been in Omaha going on 8 years, former military chaplain. I'm an online chaplain for online university. And I love just the work with racial issues and different biases, experiencing it myself as a woman. And I've seen it as a Hispanic, and then also just being involved in a lot of work here in Omaha. So thank you, Eric.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I will admit, when you said inhale, exhale, I inhaled and I exhaled just to get it out there. I want to switch over. Nick, thank you so much for being with us. Please, up to 2 minutes. Go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience here tonight.
Sure. Thanks, Eric, for the introduction, and thanks everyone at Countryside for having us. And I just want to say it's a huge honor to be on the same panel as Cynthia and Preston, who I both admire so much and have learned so much from in my own journey. So thank you to you two for all that you do. So I'm a filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, and I'm a native of Omaha. And I started working on a film back in 2015. I was actually still in college at the time at UNO. And I was just very bothered as this kid who grew up in West Omaha, who had this perception about North Omaha that I grew up with because of what I saw in the news, because of the segregation of our city. And, all these perceptions and stereotypes were getting shattered when I met kids from North Omaha at UNO and when I actually started to, just grow my education. So I really wanted to create a film that looked into this type of division that we had. And what's so funny, and I think what ties into the discussion today is, after a couple of years of working on that, I thought I got it, right? It's like, okay, I clearly see that there's issues. Like, I just got to make sure that everyone else can see that there's issues. But it took me a really long time to see that I'm no different than anyone else in this thing. I've got my own biases. I have my own racism that I'm always going to be working on trying to shake. And it took me so long to actually connect the dots on that. And so really excited for this conversation. I think so much of it applies to how we can really make change in Omaha and kind of fight against that culture of apathy that has kind of prevented us from moving forward. So really happy to be here and provide my perspective.
Beautiful. And I am very much looking forward to hearing that perspective. But before we do that, though, we're going to introduce a man that probably needs no introduction. I'm sure as heck not going to try introducing this man, Preston Love Jr. Welcome. Please let our audience know who you are. And Preston, you are muted. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Let me just say that one of the things that I surely I think I have the echo coming from the household here, but I say some of my most profound things when I'm on mute. And so I say to you, that it's a pleasure to be on a panel with two people that I surely know and respect. And of course, Eric, as moderator, I know you also. And I see some very familiar faces of the few that I can see. They're familiar because they share something with me, gray hair. And that makes me feel good and warm and fuzzy because I know that you know what I know, which is after a lifelong of experiences of the good and the bad and the ugly of life. If you believe in God, you will accumulate all of those experiences and you will bring to a panel or to your dinner table a lot of wisdom about life. And so what do you do with that? Well, you can sit on it and die with it. Or you can share your experiences and your wisdom, and hopefully you can make a difference, not only in other people's biases, but your own. Because I've learned as a frequent lecturer and teacher, every time I stand before people to teach them something, I end up walking away learning something. And so I've devoted this phase of my life. I am a native Omahan, born and raised, and went to school here, went to the University of Nebraska, played football. Some of you may not know that, for the Huskers. Lived most of my life, adult life. By the way, my time is longer than 2 minutes because each one of the other speakers left me 30 seconds of their time. You didn't know that.
Preston, I don't believe we agreed to that whatsoever in the pre-meeting conversation.
But I'm going to be
Go
brief
ahead.
and just say that I'm glad to be with you. My experiences and some more about me will kind of come out as we have this discussion. It's a pleasure for me to be with you.
And I am absolutely delighted that I get to share a Zoom stage with you, sir. I'm sure I'm going to learn way too much tonight. Let's start off with our very first question, and it's a reaction. I do want to start with Dr. Lindenmeyer on this one. So this is the companion piece to Hidden Bias by Dr. Brian Marks. We said that earlier, so we won't go too much into the subject matter there. But something I do want to touch upon, and I would love to see your perspective on, is how does implicit bias manifest in the real world? Specifically, what have you seen as the very real world manifestations of implicit bias? You mentioned as a woman as Hispanic. How have you seen it manifest?
I think a lot of it's manifested in the way I perceive the world, and there's a lot of bias just as an American. And our background, unfortunately, as Americans and what we're taught really comes from a colonialism type of narrative. And I think I bought that hook, line, and sinker growing up and serving in the military. And it really wasn't until I began to listen to a different perspective and widen my circle, because when you're in the military, that's your tribe, and you follow the orders of your superiors, and then you marry that with also, for me, the hierarchical structure of the church, and you learn theology, and you're like, okay, that's a narrative. And so when those narratives, I began to widen my perception and realize that a lot of it's based on false realities. One has to almost unthread the education, step back, and start anew. And I realized all these biases I carried were formed from a white European Eurocentric narrative, or a Western Christian patriarchal narrative. And you put those together, and I think it can be very dangerous. And sadly, that's how many of us are formed here in America. And one of the things that Dr. Marks talked about was, look who your friends are, look who your inner circle is. And so thankfully, one thing the military did is my inner circle, especially as a military chaplain, is I was good friends with rabbis and an imam who taught me so much about Islam that really sent me into a deep dive on that religion. It was much different than what I thought about Islam. And then, of course, having friends who are different skin colors. And here in Omaha, I'd say probably the 10 people I spend the most time with, it's a pretty good mix. And I'm fortunate to be on the panel. Preston, I call him my dad. His wife's like my mom. And I feel like Nick's my son. So this is just a big family affair here.
Beautiful. And well, so let's keep it in the family, this whole discussion, and we'll jump over to Mr. Love. So I would like to ask you the same question. However, I would like to flavor it as, how has it manifested in the systemic issues that plague North Omaha and the Black community in Omaha? And you are muted, sir.
You know, I learned quite a bit, quite frankly, and watching the Dr. Mark, because while I think I would understand biases and its pieces, whether implicit or explicit, actually, maybe not. I surely understand and have experienced in my youth. I would say that I didn't consider biases. I considered relationships and who I interacted with them and how they acted. Didn't go so far as to try to put a label on it, maybe in some cases racism. Of course, I grew up in Omaha in the 40s and the 50s. And to say it shortly, we were redlined, we were discriminated against, we were boxed in, if you will, and experienced all sorts, top to bottom, racism. But guess what? We didn't care. We were people who were unified in our poverty, unified in our discriminatory life. And so we were happy not to be discriminated, but in a funny kind of way, we endured in spite of it. And so we surely did, and I surely did in my growing up, in my youth, experience it all. The redlining was a big part of it. We lived in an area in North Omaha that was in effect boxed in by both practice and law. And we could not rent or buy outside that area because of discrimination or because of the institutional and systemic, as you mentioned, because the lenders would not loan the money to buy a house outside that area and so forth and so on. But I'll tell you, it did not dominate us. And so it wasn't until the adult part of my life where you begin to look at it a little more profoundly. Because by then you realize that people are not who you think they are. They might slap you on the back and smile in your face and work against you because of the implicit biases that they have. It's easy to analyze and understand the explicit, the person who would call you by the N word or some other something that would be racist and offensive. That's easy. But the implicit took, at least in my evolution, it took a while to see that as I went through a University of Nebraska in Lincoln. That at the time that I went there were probably 15 African Americans on the entire campus. And I could share with you those experiences. And it was embedded with all sorts of implicit and explicit racism. even in our wonderful University of Nebraska. And then on to work for IBM for 15 years before they had African Americans who had professional jobs. And as a corporate entity, they were trying to do the right thing, trying to do change and reform. Oops, I said that about the 60s. Don't you hear that now? But, and so, yes, I experienced it all then. And so I could go on. My point is this, is that it takes a while to even understand the more profound implicit biases than it is to understand the things that are you're sitting right before us. And that lack of understanding on both sides is a time and is a teaching moment for both sides, because we're not able to work together and find a better place if I don't understand and not able to determine where those explicit biases may be in myself and in others, and vice versa. We'll never be able to do that until we understand and diagnose, the makeup of ourselves and how we react to that.
Absolutely. And I promised that we wouldn't, go into definitions much, but I'm already going to break that promise. I'm going to switch over to Nick. So in Dr. Bryant and Dr. Mark, hidden bias, he talks about the exposure to, or what I've seen as the socialization of certain ideas and people, and how we implicitly, behind the scenes in our brain, we make connections. I look back to that word cloud on Black people, for example, where he had criminal, right, was right up there, dangerous. And so I know for me, it took a long time. I had to get out of my Omaha bubble. And I think you've had a similar experience where you've had to leave your bubble before you can start seeing that you had implicit biases, these socializations. Wait, will you tell us a little bit about that journey and what you've learned from that?
Yeah, no, you're right. And what I thought was interesting about what Dr. Mark said too is how that kind of stems as the your mind trying to be efficient, right? There's like some really deep psychology behind the reason why we do that. And I think what's so key to getting past it is almost accepting that it's a reality instead of pretending like you're not susceptible to it. But yeah, for me, like a story I've told before is, as a high school kid from Millard, and this is topical because state basketball just happened, but I remember, being a student at a Millard North basketball game, and Central High School was really good at the time, and Central High, which is downtown but has lots of students from North Omaha, they have a very diverse population, and their team was entirely African American.
Go
And I
Eagles.
remember, yeah, are you a Central alum? Yeah. So they came to Millard North to play, and I remember my high school brain just assumed that Central was sort of a poor school or a kind of underprivileged school, that the education wasn't good because of that racial association that I had as a stereotype growing up. And that was one of the big breakthroughs I had going to UNO, was meeting other people from Central and realizing just how wrong that was, both literally and also just how racist that thinking was too. So, I think that for me, the big takeaway was that in this process, there's really no finish line as far as like when you get to a place where you've all of a sudden uncovered all of your biases. It's kind of just a continuous awareness process, I think. I remember even 3 or 4 years into filming my project, and I'll be hungry after filming something, and I'll decide not to stop somewhere because instinctively I think, oh, I won't get as good of service there because it's in this part of town or something. And it's like, oh, wait a second, like I was just spending my entire day trying to fight against or showcase that exact type of kind of systemic issue. And so like it's something that, at least as white people, we're racially always experiencing, but I think all people experience biases too. And it's kind of a universal thing that we can kind of actually relate to is that we all have skin in the game when it comes to trying to overcome those types of biases.
Right. And I want to call out something that you said that I think all of us can take away from is when it comes to implicit bias, this almost insidious force that happens because our brain is trying to just be a bit more efficient, um, that we have to accept that that is a reality, that we are socialized in a certain way through either school or society or what have you. And our brain makes those connections. Acceptance, I think, is a big piece of reducing it. So I want to stay with you, Nick, because so you talked about your project. How much sleep have you lost is the working title, and I'm going to read the description here. It's a multi-year odyssey that examines racism, privilege, and faith in Omaha through three lenses: the city, the church, the family. Wow. Number one. Number two, my question is, at, through this odyssey and through everything that you've seen through the lens, when it comes to the to racism, multi-year, and privilege and faith, give me one word. I'm going to give you one word to tell me what you've learned from this experience through this project. One word.
The one word I would say is self.
Why?
I, for so long, thought that this was all about teaching others and showcasing something to others, whether it be the city of Omaha or whether it be my family, because my story became very micro, still is very micro, examining relationships in my family. And after a while, you just realize that you can't change anyone. It's up to the person to change themselves. And so all we can do is work on ourselves and hopefully try to live an example of what we can do better for others in a way that they can maybe see that and change. Because you know, if you're trying to kind of going around and force change upon people, you know, you're going to have a lot of difficult times. And I just realized it was very freeing for me to realize that the best work that you can do, or at least the starting work that you can do, is with yourself. And it took going through those mistakes of trying to have these conversations and failing, or you know, kind of being stepped aside by a mentor to show me a different direction, to finally realize that this is about your own journey. And that is, I think, the biggest, that if I had to distill it to one word, self is the one I would choose.
I absolutely love that you chose that word. And I'm going to connect to something that Preston said earlier. And I'm going to even do one more connection on what Dr. Marks was telling us, that the deep work needed when it comes to implicit bias is messy. It's uncomfortable. It's emotional. It's difficult. And so it's something that you have to work at, and it's gonna take a long process. Now I'm gonna wave my wand and say, okay, we've done the work. At least one person in the world has done that work and has cleared their implicit bias. Maybe they're ready to turn that into an energy, maybe an activism. So I'm gonna head on over to Dr. Lindenmeyer, and I want to connect sacred activism. Please, will you tell us what it's about and how people can practice it?
Well, sacred activism were founded on finding out what breaks your heart. And whatever breaks your heart, that is your DNA, that is your mission in life, your purpose in life. And when those two sacred bonds come together, then your activism, whether it be um, working towards reconciliation or racial work or it could be many things. But one of my passions is working towards racial reconciliation here in Omaha. And maybe it's because I didn't grow up here, but when it took me a few years, because when our family first moved here, we were kind of in our own little territory. I live in La Vista, and I really didn't venture north of 72nd Street until I worked at a church that was at 72nd and Cass. And that's when I learned that Omaha is divided into these three sections, and it didn't make sense to me. I learned more about why do we have, I don't even know, are we at 8 or 9 school districts here in Omaha? Because growing up in Houston, you just had the Houston Independent School District, and that pretty much included, over 30 or 40 schools. But here we're divided educationally, we're divided in the way the buses run, we're divided in the way realtors show housing, and we're divided in so many ways. And I would love to see some kind of reconciliation happen in this town. And it's frustrating to me that the powers that were in place 100 years ago are still in place, and that we don't have Hispanics in leading governmental positions, or we don't have African Americans or Native Americans in those leadership positions, because I think it would be a huge game changer in the way the city relates to itself and develops. And you can see it in the way the tax increments are done, like blighted area, Crossroads Mall. That's not a blighted area, but they're getting that TIF funding. And I was just in North Omaha last week, and coming home, we still had snow on the ground, hit a major pothole. And I know there's potholes in West Omaha, but it was like being in Iraq, driving with all the potholes. And look at the vaccination processes. You look at the Douglas County dashboard, it's a disparity there versus people of color who have been vaccinated versus your white, predominantly white population that has been vaccinated. And I just wish this town could start over, and we could all just love one another, as simple as that sounds, and get away from these huge racial divides and they're killing our kids too, because our kids are, as Nick pointed out, he grew up with it, and his film is phenomenal. I cannot wait till it's done, and I think it will really help white people in Omaha to understand white privilege and their implicit biases that they have.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Preston, I want to turn to you, but before I do, and I'm going to ask you to be just a little vulnerable with me, with our audience. I'll kick things off. I'll model this. Um, Something that breaks my heart. I live in South Omaha. What breaks my heart is how we have chosen, and what I mean we is a society, to treat meatpacking plant workers as essential to get meat out, but when it's time to give the first COVID shots, not so much. So that breaks my heart. Will you tell us what breaks your heart?
Well, I surely appreciate all aspects of what you just asked. My being vulnerable, and then also what breaks my heart. I would say that what breaks my heart is reflected in the picture that is behind me on the video. And as a matter of fact, just for the record, I believe that a number of people, are you not in this picture, Cynthia, Dr. Lindenmeyer?
I think I took the picture.
Oh, and Nick, are you not in it? Or
I don't think I'm in that one.
okay, but you were there. And what this is a picture of what breaks my heart to bring me to action. Sacred activism in the real is in that picture. That picture is about 100 people from Omaha, Nebraska, predominantly youth, high school kids, and adults who are standing at the mouth of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. And the reason that they're there is because my heart is eternally broken, because it occurred to me years here past that my African American youth have no clue about their African American history and, to some degree, their culture. It turns out, after a year or two, I found that void can be found across the races. That's why they're not all African Americans in that picture. And so I embarked on activism to try to teach my African American, and maybe later, as you can see, those youth are learning about the African American history and culture. And guess what? It transformed them, and it affected their implicit biases. What broke my heart was that that job needed to be done and it was not being done. And so that activated me to help do it. There's a lesson in that for all of us, whether it be taking 100 people to 5 cities in the South, paying their way and teaching them about Jackson, Mississippi, and Memphis, Tennessee, and Birmingham, Alabama, and go to Selma and on to Montgomery and Atlanta, or if it is just teaching your family about other people's culture and history. And guess what? The net effect of that will be slowly but surely, we'll be able to chip at people's unfortunate implicit biases, and surely on the ones that are explicit. So the vulnerability is that I'm telling on my community when I say that my community's youth had no idea about their own civil rights history, and that some of us needed to be active in a sacred sort of way to take that challenge up and do that and do more.
I um I very much appreciate that that education is being done. I myself am listening to a book called Harvest of Empire. It's a Latino American Hispanic history in America, and I'm learning so much about my own culture and background in history as Latino male, um, on how things have evolved in the Americas. Nick, if you are able, will you be vulnerable with us, and what breaks your heart?
Yeah, what breaks my heart is how the talking about these issues can be so divisive within themselves when it comes to bringing them up with family members and friends who disagree with you, and the just the angst that people can hold on to, or the resentments because of it, is what really breaks my heart. Because there's a lot to be said about how far can we get if half the country, so to speak, or whatever, can't move forward when it comes to this stuff. But simultaneously, there has to be some empathy and compassion from to those people that you disagree with. So that's what breaks my heart, and I experienced it firsthand in my film, and trying to engage with a loved one who was dying. It was my dad, and he had cancer, and we disagreed on a lot of different things, not just about race in America, but about politics and about faith and all of these things. And from my perspective, that's what breaks my heart. But I certainly, relate with what Cynthia and Preston said too about, and what you said too. All of those things are stuff that I feel as well.
And thank you again for being vulnerable with us, Dr. Lindenmeyer. We have a lot of broken hearts here.
Yeah.
So I have a big important task for you. What tell us, what can faith, what can spirituality tell us about maybe what can fill our cups back up? Why is this so important to take on activism and maybe try to, I don't know, fix, maybe too strong of a word, but help advance the causes of our broken hearts?
Yeah, Preston mentioned earlier relationships. And I think when you get to know maybe what you've at some point dubbed the other, you realize the other is really of the same energy or prana that we all are. We are all made of the stardust that creates us, and we are really all one. And I know we're not going to go down the environmental road, but when we realize that the earth, when we ground into the earth, when we realize the earth is part of us and that we are just a whole network of beings and we're created in love, and whatever your faith is, or if you don't have a faith, I think love is so important. And if there's two emotions that are stronger than what I feel perpetuates hidden biases is uncertainty and fear. And if you can take hope, that's so much stronger than uncertainty. And if you can take love, that's so much stronger than fear. And whatever narrative you're following that keeps your protective personality defensive, if you can just open up your heart and let go of your narrative and listen to someone else's narrative, it can change things. And Nick, his film really shows that he struggles trying to do that, but his dad's struggling from the other perspective. But there's no doubt that the two of them loved one another and respected one another. And one aspect of, especially he brought up politics, is I had a lot of political differences with friends on Facebook, because in the military, there's a lot of conservatism there. But what we tried to do was keep our friendship and listen to one another. Yet at the same time, as an activist, um, I believe that calling them to love others and set aside their differences is very important. And I believe Dr. Marks talked about is, if you have a relationship and it's negative, sometimes you just got to get out of that relationship. And uh, and I've done that. I've really limited my inner circle to 10 people, and they're all people who are open to explore, open to learn, open to love, open to be active, and that's positive energy. And I think it's very important to really surround yourself with that energy. And if you have someone, let's say in your family, who brings on negative energy, that's where meditation and grounding yourself and really refilling your cup is so important.
And so this question will be to anybody. It'll be an open question to any of our panelists. But before that, I do want to let our audience know we will have some time for Q&A at the end here, anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes. So if you have any burning questions, please throw them into the chat, or raise your hand, or you can go off mute when the time comes and ask that question. But I want you to be thinking about it. So back to the panelists. Dr. Marks talks about maybe some of the promising practices of managing or reducing implicit bias. I want to ask this question through your lens, and this is an open question of, what do you see as maybe those opportunities for Omahans to reduce or manage their implicit bias? What have you gleaned?
I surely like to weigh in on it first, but
Yes, sir.
I want to just mention something that's almost out of context with your question, but I'll make it short. And that is, let us not forget, and one of the things that occurred to me as I understood Dr. Mark and I understood my and our realities, was how much in this 2021 environment, how divisive we have turned out to be. But I wanted to point that divisiveness to people who have studied biases and who activate it on purpose. And they play into our biases and divide us. And so I say to all of us, don't let somebody do that to us. In other words, they're making it worse on purpose. And we some time will be like sheep and follow that road. Want to make sure that we learn from that. The other thing is, to your question, is what are some of the things? Well, I think that there is an opportunity sitting all the time, everywhere, that we're overlooking when we have relationships with groups or people. And that is, and it may sound easy, to react to at first, but finding that common ground and then working from there. That sounds easy, and it is if you choose to do so. I am doing some work with the UNO volleyball team. And the volleyball team, turns out, is entirely white female women. And so the question and the reason I was speaking with them is because they're all wonderful young ladies, but they're in the bubble that you mentioned, Eric. They're wonderful and their life is wonderful. And they're really kind of inside that bubble, not realizing the complexities outside that bubble, and that they're going to have to learn them, or they'll go out there in the world later, or maybe tomorrow, and find out there is some raw things as it relates to interpeople relationships, race, and all of that. And so the common ground that I sought with them, and just trust me that it worked like magic, it was experimental, is I had my lovely wife. Well, I'm going to say this. The common ground is everybody on who is viewing loves pie, don't you? So the question I asked you, even though, and I'll be brief, Eric, is how many of you have had sweet potato pie? And the answer is many of the whites, no matter what your age, but 100% of the volleyball team had never had sweet potato pie. And did you know that sweet potato pie is the number one, probably the number one pie in the African American? I see you shaking your head, Gloria. It's one of the number one pies in the African American community. And so if I say to you, have you had sweet potato pie? And you say no, I say to you, you haven't learned much about my culture. And so I had my wife make 3 sweet potato pies to open up a conversation about something simple as that. And they got the message that, oh my goodness, I didn't realize, I thought it was only pumpkin pie. And I didn't know sweet potato pie. And so what happened is we got into a discussion of the African American culture, and it was a wow moment for those young ladies. And it was because we found a common ground. And then we were able to talk about what Dr. Marx called the messy part. But we had already become friends. And so look for those opportunities in the messy world to find common ground.
And I love that you said that piece, because Dr. Marx also talks about an aha moment that is the same there, where you're able to number one, you have the cognitive dissonance there, but then you also have an acceptance of, oh, there is either commonality or there is an implicit bias at work there. Nick or Dr. Lindenmeyer, Cynthia, do you want to weigh in on the question, or maybe react to what Dr. or Mr. Love here was talking about?
Yeah, with respect to the question, the two things that Dr. Marx said that, as far as proactive things that I thought were interesting and that I think would help Omaha, is he talks about labeling the response that happens as stereotypical when it happens, and he talks about increasing opportunities for positive contact. And I think what's great about both of those things is that those are things you can do in your individual life that are actually quite small and sometimes quite private. A lot of that, you could be doing those things and no one will even know that you're doing anything different, but you're actually still doing something better. And the reason I think that's interesting is to tie this back into faith a lot is, think about how much, especially in Christian teaching, there's so much in the gospel about the acts of faith you do when no one knows it, kind of praying or worshiping or trying to be better, inside when no one's seeing what you're doing. I think that's what is real progressive work. That's real activism. That is real change. And I think that it's so important to take the conversation there, because there's so much work to be done, I think, especially in the faith communities to move forward. So I think if like we can draw that type of kind of conclusion about that, the parallels of that type of work and that kind of teachings that you'll find in scripture, we could have such a great breakthrough. So that was kind of a connection I made based off some of the things that we could do better that has been sticking with me.
The answers are already there. They're written in the book or in the books. Dr. Lindenmeyer, anything you want to add there?
Well, I think coming from a Christian perspective, if you look at Christ, he took things from the concrete world and he told the parables, and he created like an own reality. And there was a woman, she lost a coin, or there was a father who had two sons, uh, and it helped people to enter in a different world and see the lesson and not become defensive. But I do think just taking time to be still within oneself, and when someone says something that we might take personally, to not react to that. I think that comes from being the stillness. And I will say Martha's sweet potato pies are very good.
And Preston, where you were telling that story, I was thinking to myself, how has somebody not had sweet potato pie? But that's my own bubble, I guess. So in the last few minutes, very precious few minutes we have left, I do want to make sure if anybody has any questions for our panelists or anything you'd like them to expand on, please go ahead and you can either raise your hand or unmute or throw it in the chat. John, I'm seeing your hand there. Please go ahead.
So I was very interested in Nick's explanation for his passionate word self. And I think that's so true. And so my basic question is, how do we inspire more people to look at their self? I get totally that you can't talk people into changing, very easily anyway. And when you ask people if they are racist, implicit or explicit, or knowing that they are, there's no way that they admit to themselves they are. So this self is very inspiring, but how do we inspire others to do that?
Yeah, great question. It's so tricky because every single person is so different. Everyone's on a different spectrum when it comes to how open-minded they are, or how closed off they are to this type of discussion. But I've found that I think a way to get someone to maybe start looking at their self with this stuff is, okay, say for example, someone says, I don't believe white privilege, or I don't think racism is around in America anymore. You can start by saying, okay, well, tell me why you think that, and then try to ask these follow-up questions that get at how they feel, and then discover the emotions that they're feeling, and try to see, okay, are they coming from a place of fear? Are they coming from a place of misunderstanding? Are they coming from a place of a lack of exposure? And maybe try to keep asking questions that have them thinking about how this pertains in their own life. And maybe that's enough space that will then let their kind of subconscious do some work, so that you don't have to be the one that is solving the equation for them. But it's so difficult. It's certainly not easy. It's funny because when Eric asked me to come up with a word, one of the words that popped up in my head was just hard. That was one of the words. So it's really difficult work. But yeah, I think just trying to be persistent about making things personal for people helps.
I think that emotional root cause analysis is, I think, very important there. I do want to. That was a very good question there. I do want to throw a shout out or highlight Cynthia, a few thoughts about how talking about self can sometimes be considered as pride, or be humble is maybe understood. And she would like to, she's wondering out loud for our panelists then, what kind of insight we might have when it comes to talking about or focusing on self or being humble. You might be muted there, Preston.
The time is short in terms of developing what's in my head, but one of the things that maybe I would surely want to make sure that I said tonight to all of you, and I am looking at the full panel. You are all very beautiful people here. I didn't realize I would have dressed up a little bit if I'd have known who I was going to be standing before. But I say to you is that the self part is that there's another word that can go with self, is to realize about ourselves. Realize that we do have the biases, and that realize how many of us have wanted or have traveled to other places, even in the United States, where foreign fields. Why do we do that? Aren't you satisfied with what you see in Omaha? You want to see a broader, a greater world. And guess what? It's the same thing about people and their cultures. It's like traveling. And when you return to your home base, to your biases, they will be changed, and you will have a wider view and a wider understanding and an appreciation for the wide world of people and their cultures, and your biases will change. And you will then be an agent for change as you move on. Don't forget that you do have biases, is to acknowledge it, embrace it for change.
Yeah, and I would say, I know Dr. Marks talked about the way to evolve on the area of the hidden biases is to enter into a period of discomfort. I mean, it's not easy work. You've got to do your homework, and it's difficult. And so, like you were saying, Eric, when you were talking about the book you were reading, I'm doing some reading right now about Central America and South America on the olvidados, the forgotten. And it's a period in the 70s where over 30,000 people just disappeared. And that's something, if I learned it in history, then I guess I was numb to it. I didn't pay attention to it. But we're coming, yesterday we just passed really the 1 year mark of the pandemic when things shut down. And what awakening has happened. And I think that's what's important, is looking at yourself and asking, have I evolved? Am I awakening? And if you're comfortable in your life right now, then I would just say that maybe you need to enter into a period of discomfort to really evolve and kind of spiritually grow or expand. And discomfort is always a great way to grow, especially spiritually.
And I think handling and taking on our own implicit biases through discomfort, through challenging our preconceived notions, is a great way to grow as a person. In the precious 1 minute each that we have left, this will be the last question. Just anything else that maybe we haven't covered that you just have on your heart that you have to let our audience know. Preston, I will start with you. I'm only giving you 1 precious minute. You are muted, sir.
What I would want you to know is that there's a love that I feel in my heart for all of you. I feel the vibes from some of you, and that, guess what? It comes from an African American, and that's progress. I look at Raj, my heart goes out to you. I don't know why I picked you out, but you represent a bridge for biases to disappear. and I hope they will.
Beautiful. Nick or Cynthia?
Yeah, so what I'll say is, it's great to see a good crowd here, and one thing I would share, part of my journey has been, I've found that I get tripped up sometimes when I beat myself up too much about this stuff, thinking that I'm not making enough progress, or that there's no hope, or that it can be difficult, this path of trying to be anti-racist and better. And I think the key to sustaining yourself is not taking things personally, and also not getting discouraged when you do make mistakes, because again, going back to the point at the very beginning, this stuff is implicit. It's baked into our psyche. It's part of being in a society, and I have to constantly remind myself of that, to then not get a resentment, or to get jaded, or to want to kind of tap out from this work. So I would always, that's like one thing I recommend that people always remember, is to not take things personally, or to feel that when doing this stuff. And then the other piece I'll say is, my film was referenced a bunch, and it's got obviously a tie into this conversation, but such a tie into faith too, on a different level. And I've connected with people at Countryside and Beyond before this as well. But I'll put a link to my film's website in the chat here, so if people are curious to know more about it, they can check it out. And there's a contact page too, if you want to connect directly with me. I would love that too. So yeah, thanks, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, for please share that link, and audience, please go ahead and click and check out his film. Cynthia, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I guess maybe just pick a day this week. Of course, we're experiencing a lack of sleep, so that week after daylight savings is always rough. But pick a day this week and carry maybe a little notebook or something, and just as you go to the grocery store, or you're driving, or whatever you're doing, be aware of that narrative that's going on in your mind, that's categorizing and judging, and that's dualistic, and be aware of it. And let's say you see someone and you just think of a judgment. Ask yourself, okay, this is what I thought, and why did I think that? And I think the more you can be aware of that inner voice that's going all the time, and understanding the why behind what you're thinking, it's a great way to grow. And I constantly find myself just out in the world judging and categorizing. It's just the way we are. But I check it and ensure it doesn't affect maybe a word or action. And I don't always succeed, but I think the awareness is a great first step to understand what's going on in your mind, and why it's thinking that way.
Beautiful. Reflect. Don't beat yourself up. Choose love. I think that's a great way to end it. Thank you all. Thank you, Preston. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Cynthia, so much for joining us today. I think this was an amazing conversation. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Please, I hope you'll get a chance to reflect on this and maybe challenge your own implicit biases, your own hidden biases. Thank you so very much. Please have a great rest of your evening. Thank you all.
Thank you from Countryside.
If anybody
Thank you,
wants
everybody.
to see Dr. Marx's program again, I believe it will be on the KMTV website. But thank you, all of you, for doing this great panel. We so appreciate it.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Great job, Cynthia and Preston.
Thank you, everyone. This was so helpful. Beginning with Dr. Marx, it's like I'm breathing more easily. And I haven't felt comfortable for years about all of this. So thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
My pleasure. My pleasure to be with you all this evening.
Mhm.
And hello there, Vince. See that Vince Lindenmeyer down there? That's Cynthia's husband. He's in Florida soaking up the sun. We should give him a frown, big real frown.
It's raining here.